Hello, how are you? Our last week, can you believe it? It's been a whirlwind. For many of you, it's been a really difficult semester. There's been lots going on as things have opened up. A number of you have been unwell or caring for people who are unwell. It's just been a tough time of year. It always is. The second semester is always harder, even when you start in second semester. It's just harder. I think it's the lousy weather at the beginning, and not that the weather's really improved terribly much, but there's been a lot going on. And so here's the point in time where I'd actually just like you to pat yourselves on the back for getting to this point. And it really has been a pleasure working with those of you that I've had the opportunity to talk to. You're a hard-working bunch, and I feel good about where the profession is heading as I see the work that you've been doing. So without messing around too much, I'm hoping that this will be one of the shortest lecture packages that I make. And what I'm planning to do is make up for what I do in double quick time today by augmenting over the next couple of weeks some little mini catch-up lectures, sort of highlights for the key topics. Speaking of which, this is what I'm planning to do today. In what I'm expecting is probably only going to be one lecture this time, and hopefully we won't go for more than 20 minutes or so. Let's see. So what I want to do is start off with some tips and tricks for the exam preparation. I'm going to outline what's on the exam, not the actual problems, but the structure of the exam, and really go through what it is I think you need to do to go in and be well prepared. And then as I said, over the next couple of weeks, you should expect to see some kind of highlight reels, for want of a better term. And they're going to be basically broken up as follows. I've kind of color-coded this slide to give you an indication of where it is I think you should be throwing your efforts. Now, in weeks 2, 3, 4, and 11, we basically covered a range of technology-focused topics. And I've put these in amber as opposed to green because you've done the work in this space. There's not a lot that you will be able to do to revise that material beyond reading over it and thinking about how it fits in the evolution of the profession and the ethical rules. The focus of the exam will be very much on the rules and the sources of those rules and how they're used in practice. Now, there is absolutely no doubt some of the questions, perhaps all of the questions, will have a technology aspect to them, but from a problem-solving perspective and for a focused perspective, right now I think you would be better off focusing on the work that we did in week 1, week 6, 7, and 8, 9, and 10. And so they are the kind of mini topics that I've isolated out here. Now, clearly at the exam point of time, we're bringing everything together. So do not be misled. Do not come back to me afterwards saying, but you told me not to study the tech topics again. I am not telling you not to study them. I'm just saying that your focus and attention really needs to be on the detail around the rules and how to apply them. And when doing so, you need to think about them in the context of technology, because some or all of the problems may well have a technology lens applied to them. So there's my starting off warning. Let's start by looking at my tips and tricks. And in this section as well, I will give you an overview of the structure of the exam. The first piece of advice, the best piece of advice that I can give you is that you need to manage your time. This means you need to read all of the questions really carefully, and you need to allocate your time appropriately. Now, when we've been preparing the exam, and by the way, this is for this subject and this exam, the rules might work, not rules, but the approach that your lecturer takes in other subjects might be slightly different. But I work on the basis you've got 2.5 hours from the second that you download this exam until it has to be uploaded. And if you don't get it uploaded in the amount of time that it takes, then there are penalties as a consequence of that. In an exam room, your paper would just be whisked out of your hand, and we're doing the technological equivalent of that, I understand. So you've got 2.5 hours, or I'm going to call that 150 minutes from woe to go. So when I've been preparing this exam, I've worked on the basis that you're going to spend 100 minutes of that time, 2/3 of that time, bashing out your answers, writing. And so when you're thinking about that, the exam has 50 marks. You've got 100 minutes of writing time. You should be allocating your time on the basis that there's 2 minutes for every point. So if one of the short answer questions, for example, and I'll come to the structure in a minute, let's say a short answer question is a 3-point question, you got it. I would be expecting you're spending about 6 minutes writing an answer to that question. Now, why is this important? Because all of the questions will be hard. It's not an easy exam, and it's certainly a manageable exam. It's an exam that has been set on the basis that if you have done the work and you have allocated the amount of time that's been recommended each week to study and reading, that you should be able to provide competent answers in that amount of time relatively easily. But it's a hard exam in the sense that you will really need to be completely on it in order to shine. On it is not necessarily a technical academic term or legal term for that matter, but I suspect that you know what I mean. The art, not that you really care about the art of exam writing, I get that, but the art of exam writing involves finding questions that a competent student should pass. If you can't pass it, having done the work, then that's a reflection on our teaching more than anything else. If you don't pass, it's usually because you haven't done the work or you mismanage your time. But it also needs to have room for a good student to really shine. It needs to be hard enough for you to find, the good students to find that spark, that thing that they can point to that is going to help them distinguish themselves from everybody else. And so, yes, some of the problems will have twists or tricks in them that you might not recognize. Now, these are not tricks to be mean to you. They're twists or available information, opportunities for the students who have really worked hard to be able to stand out, the ones that have a gift for this subject to really distinguish themselves highly. That's why we call it a high distinction from their teammates or their colleagues, I should say. So if you have 100 minutes to bash out your answers, that would leave around 15 minutes for your initial reading and planning out how you're going to respond, and around 20 minutes to refine and proof, to go back over the previous questions and really make sure that you've answered the question, you've said what you wanted to see. Maybe you have a minute or two to address a less important point that you didn't get time when you were managing your time to include. And you got another 15 minutes then of faffing around to get it uploaded. Because once you get to 2.5 hours, that is too late. So it needs to be uploaded within that time. In an exam room, in a face-to-face exam situation, it's a 2-hour exam with 15-minute reading time. The rules may have changed since pre-COVID for those exams, but it was the case that students were not allowed to do any writing during the reading time. Personally, I find that a little bit cruel and unusual, to be clear. I think that you need reading time. You need to be able to use your pen during reading time. You need to be able to circle things. You need to be able to start mocking out your plan. Having said that, it is a super, super, super good idea to make sure before you start that you read the paper from beginning to end, that you are really clear on how many questions there are to answer. Take that second while you're going through to make sure you tick off all of the questions. And this is really important because unless you answer the question and you answer every question, and if those questions have multiple parts, that you make sure you answer all of the parts, then you are going to do okay. But if you miss a question or you miss a part of a question, it's actually impossible, if you don't answer the question, for us to give you any marks at all. Now, you don't actually have to get the question right in order to get the marks. You might actually get the question wrong, but we're looking at a range of different factors as we're marking. We're looking at whether you've identified the right issues. We're looking at whether you've identified the law that applies in relation to those issues. We're looking at whether you've been able to apply that law in a sensible way, and we're looking at the conclusions that you draw. So sometimes, particularly if you miss an issue, that means you miss a whole set of relevant rules and you don't apply them and you end up with the wrong conclusion. But you've still done something. And as I like to say, the gap between 49 and 50 is quite small. But the gap between 79, a distinction, and 80, a high distinction, is really, really big. So when you're managing your time, think about the way to do that strategically, because a really, really good answer to one question could still see you fail if you do not answer the other question, where a competent or mediocre answer to all of the questions will definitely see you pass. The next thing I need to talk to you about is IRAC. Now, I know this is drilled into you in a range of different subjects, but there is, with the problem question in particular, there is real value in following IRAC. So IRAC is about identifying the issue, reciting the law, applying the law, and ultimately reaching a conclusion. So in order to do that, you really need to get used to thinking about all of the component parts of your study in an IRAC format. So in particular, you might be thinking about when you're taking notes, particularly when you're doing your case summaries or topic summaries, it's a really good idea to identify, well, what are all of the issues that are likely to come up? Which rules are relevant to each of those issues? And then if there's a case or a section in your reading that you can't link to an issue, you need to go back and think about it a little bit harder, because we're not just giving you pieces of things to read for the sake of it. Every rule that you're asked to adopt will have an issue associated with it. Now, the tricky part: how do those rules apply? Now, clearly, context is everything, and often you're distinguishing on the facts when you're using IRAC questions. And part of the trick to doing problem questions well is to get really good at identifying which of the facts are material, which ones are not, and not going outside the scope of the facts, not making things up in the facts to adopt what it is that you want to say or adapt to what it is that you say. So again, a great way of actually preparing for this is think about the cases themselves. How did the law apply to those fact scenarios? What things stood out? What did the judges say in the ratio or in at obiter that help you understand the rationale and the reason? Now, why do I really point that out? Because, let's face it, you are doing this exam online, and we're not that dumb. So we know that it is quite likely that whatever questions you get asked, you will be able to use Control F across your notes to find things, and you will use Google, or you can use the search engines to basically find information. This is one of the key themes we've been talking about in this unit. One of the reasons we're putting technology and ethics together in the way that we have. It is no longer the case that you get good marks at law school, or even more importantly, that you become respected as a superior practitioner because you are able to find information. That is a given. Being able to find the law and read the law is a given. What is important and what will make you stand out, both as a student and as a practitioner, is your ability to do something with those facts, with that information, I should say, that you have pulled out. So what we will be rewarding you for more than anything else is your ability to synthesize, to analyze, to provide your point of view, to throw over the top of this your own ethical lens, the way that the rules apply, being able to identify what the source of that law is and why it is important. What is the source of these ethical rules? What is the mischief that it is trying to alleviate or mitigate in some way? And then, does the rule work? Does it do what it set out to do? Are there too many carve-outs or things that will mean that even though in principle a rule will work in a particular way, in practice it might not? What is the effect of the rule itself on achieving the outcomes? That's actually what really matters here. And that comes out of your application, but also the conclusions that you draw. And really, really important. Another thing that is really important in exams is just thinking about citations. So there are two elements here. Firstly, you are not required to use AGLC4. Of course, you are doing this online, and it's not like you're going to get a sore hand writing it out, and it's not like you have to work out how to italicize your handwriting or anything. You won't be penalised for not using AGLC4, but it may well be something you can be rewarded for. It may be just one of those things that demonstrates an extra level of care and preparation. If you've got the cases all set up and ready to go, properly set out in the citated form, it's a copy and paste to drop it into the document, and it demonstrates a level of care that matters. So whilst you don't have to, why wouldn't you? So number one. Even more important, number two, significantly more important, this is about making good choices. It is pretty easy to look up the index of your book. That actually might be difficult if you don't have a physical book in the circumstances, but you know what I mean. It might be easy to just look at your notes and see, okay, these are the cases that we looked at when we were discussing conflicts of interest. That must be an appropriate case. That's a start. But really being able to demonstrate that you really understand and you know the law will mean that you will pick the right case. You will pick the case that has the most analogous facts, or which is higher in the precedent hierarchy than another decision. Or you might choose a lower court decision because it's analogous on the facts, but you might want to point out that it is consistent or inconsistent with a higher ranking precedent. Making good choices, being judicious about what to include and also what to leave out can make a big difference in almost any assignment. I think I spoke about this when I was talking about assignment 2. It is a really good way of demonstrating that you have made judicious choices, that you have understood the core elements of the law. I always put the clue here, it's a good idea to use the index of your textbook or casebook or to basically just sort of work through to get to the right page of the book. There are a couple of things I want to say here. Reading your text for the first time in an exam is really, really fraught, number one. Number two, most of you have been dealing with the text online. This course was set up to be delivered online. it is highly unlikely that any of you, other than a very, very small percentage, are going to be quick enough to get into the library to have those books open when the exam is on. They're effectively not available to you in the exam. So you are relying on your notes. That's a good thing, because there's plenty of science that demonstrates any kind of activity that helps you engage with the material, including writing out the notes, will help you retain it and help you find it better. But it is a good idea to have some kind of index or color coding or something that helps you find things. Now, you might want to color code by topic, you might want to color code by issue, anything like that. But think about the best way for you to find the work that you've done to check it as you go. So I've talked a bit about things that you should do. There are definitely some things that you shouldn't do as well. So number one, please don't repeat the question as part of your answer. Make sure it is really clear which question you're answering. And by the way, there is nothing that says you have to answer them in the order that they're presented. It's often a good idea because they're sort of presented from easiest to hardest as a general rule. But if you're going through and you're looking and think, I just don't have any idea about that one, go and do something that you feel confident with first, because it will make you feel better and it will help you get things out of the way. If you've got facts, don't summarize the facts or the issue. Don't summarize the facts, issues and outcomes of the cases that you're referring to. State the ratio and cite the case. The only reason why you might refer specifically to facts is if you are distinguishing on the facts in some way. Similarly, you don't need to set out, repeat the facts, repeat the question as part of your answer. I'm just going to say that a different way. Don't repeat the facts either. Pinpoint into the facts that matter, the material facts, if you need to, as you're answering problem questions. I've said this already, I'm going to say it again. Do not miss any questions. No answer, no marks. It is much easier to get some marks when we can't give you marks if there's nothing there. If you are going to make an assumption, particularly about the way something in the question, set it out. Now, I have done my best to make sure that the questions are completely self-contained and that you don't need to make any ridiculous assumptions. But if you are not sure whether something is right or not, say so, because we'll take that into account when we're grading. So if something isn't clear, make a reasonable assumption. Don't make the assumption that suits your purposes. Make a reasonable assumption. What's likely to be happening here? But just be clear that it is an assumption. More importantly than anything, and this is like saying don't sneeze, don't panic. How well you do in an exam is just how well you do in an exam. It does not actually define whether you are a clever person, whether you are a good person, whether you are a hard-working person or not. It is an assessment task. We have assessment tasks so we can put our hands on our heart and say to the university, who in turn will say to the relevant body when you are seeking admission, that you actually learnt the things you were supposed to learn here. This is our way of checking that. That's all it's for. Nobody really remembers how they did at law school within a couple of years after getting out of there. So, just, again, don't panic, enjoy yourself. I'm not going to read the things on this slide, but I want it in the pack. So those of you who are listening along at home on the podcast, do have a look at what are called the course learning outcomes. The exam covers course learning outcomes 1 through 5. There are 6 course learning outcomes all up. What I've done on this slide, just so you can look at it, is I've highlighted the particular focus for the exam. And I've put in bold and red all of CLO number 5. Communicate in ways that are effective, appropriate, and persuasive for legal and non-legal audience, and collaborate effectively. Okay, collaborating effectively should not be bolded. We are not doing any collaboration in the exam. Okay, so let's go on and talk about what's actually on the exam. Now, clearly, I'm not going to talk about what's on the exam. I'm not going to talk about the actual questions. I'm going to talk about the format of the exam. And in your tutorials, you'll go through this again, but it should be pretty straightforward. Essentially, the exam is going to consist of 3 parts. There'll be short answer questions, 3 of those for a total of 15 marks. There'll be an IRAC style problem question, quite a complex problem, similar in some ways to the problem task from last year's exam. And there will also be an essay or a policy type question. So let's just start with them and just talk about them briefly. The 3 short questions should be your nice, clear, easy introduction. They're all kind of low risk. They could be worth as few as 3 points, and they might be worth as many as 6 or 7 points, depending on the complexity. So basically, you've got half an hour to get those 3 questions answered, and that will still give you a little bit of time to come back and proofread and clean things up. Once again, if the question itself has 2 parts, answer both parts. That includes if there are 2 questions within, even if they're not set out as question A, question B, question 1, question 2. For example, if a question asks you to address what is the source of a particular rule and do you think it is effective, then I would like to see both parts of that answered. I want to know where the rule comes from, and I want your views onto whether it's effective or not. With all of the short answer questions, you have the opportunity to show off by giving citations. So find the best and the right rule, whether that's case law or whether it's something from the uniform law or whether from the Australian Solicitors Conduct Rules, or if applicable, the barristers' rules, to explain and provide some substance to your point of view. I'd like to see these responded to. Part of what we're assessing here, as I just mentioned previously, is your ability to communicate clearly. So bullet points should be avoided. Look, if you've run out of time, you're coming back to do them at the end and you can't get there, something is better than nothing, absolutely. But if you want to do well, and you do want to do well, right? Make sure that you set it out clearly and demonstrate your ability to communicate clearly with your audience. And yeah, so basically make that pretty straightforward. So again, they should be concise. We're guessing that you're going to be spending about as many, like 2 minutes for every 1 mark. Part 2 will be a longer IRAC style problem. It will be relatively complex. It will have subparts in it, so it'll be very clear what subsections you need to answer. So you'll get a set of facts and you will be asked essentially what the consequences are for 1, 2, 3, 4 participants in the problem, or it might focus on a particular set of rules. Again, that will be a 20-point question where we'll be expecting, this is the biggest question on the exam, we'd be expecting you'll be spending around 40 minutes on it, and that later on you'll be able to come back and tidy it up a little bit if you need to. Ideally, the students who are really good will actually put this out in a kind of advice format. You will be using paragraphs. It will be really clear what it is that you are saying to us. But that's a way to get extra marks, is to make sure that you structure it really well. However, you are asked to do it in the IRAC format, so it is really important to make sure it's really clear what the issues are, what the rules are, how they apply, and what your conclusions are. Have absolutely no real problem with, I for issue, blah, 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 blah. R for rule. This is what the rules are. For many of you, that will be the best way to approach it, and it also de-risks the chances that you won't actually cover off all of those elements. Actually, just before I move on from problem questions, essentially these are designed to raise multiple issues, and that may include some issues where there might not be a clear answer, and it's absolutely okay if you don't know the answer, but you need to do the analysis and explain your reasoning. It's going to be really important that you identify the main issues. That's probably more important than anything else, because if you don't identify all of the issues, you won't be able to link the rules and the application and the conclusions. Lastly, the essay or policy type question. These are an opportunity for you to tell us what you think about the law, what you know about the law, without being constrained by a set of facts. So I know some of you are going to go through, find examples of previous class essays or previous exam questions and write pre-prepared answers. I would strongly urge you not to do that, because you will risk answering the question that you want to have been asked as opposed to the question that really has been asked. Now, actually, swapping back to part one, there is something that I hadn't said. One of the type of questions that comes up from time to time essentially will give you a short fact scenario and will ask you to prepare notes for a meeting. So effectively, these kind of questions are aimed at making sure you identify what the issues are and provide the opportunity for you to show your synthesis and your analysis and your originality by giving you the opportunity to think, okay, this is what I know now. What do I need to know in order to give some advice here? What questions would I ask the client? And the notes are really to tell us why you would ask those questions, like what it is that you're looking for. So now here, focus in on the law. Yes, many of you will have done client interviewing and stuff, so you might be tempted to go from another subject and say, well, the question says to prepare for a meeting with Cath about her, the ethical complaint that the Wookiee has made against her. And you might be tempted to sort of fill it in with, make sure she has a glass of water and that she feels comfortable and settled. You don't need to have that in your notes. Your notes or your file note is really, let's get to the substance of what this issue might be. And so really you would be asking, the example that I got here, well, one of the first questions might be, what complaint has the Wookiee actually made? What is your relationship with the Wookiee? Are you its lawyer? Is it your lawyer? What is the relationship? Have previous complaints been made? Has an investigation been initiated? Again, this is a really good opportunity, these questions, to demonstrate your thinking. And with that, I think really the biggest piece of advice that I can give you is there is an art to exams. Sure, some of you will be better at them than others for sure. But ultimately, the one thing that you can do is go in prepared, be systematic, and be confident. You've done the work. You know this stuff. Now is an opportunity for you to pull it out and to show us. So preparing for the exams, there are a number of different things that you can do. Everybody studies differently. You all have different strategies. Your reading for this week is essentially a chapter about exam strategies. It is useful and you should read it, and contemplate it, reflect on it. I'm a big fan of checklists and flowcharts. Often, given the nature of these questions, I would do my checklists and flowcharts with half a mind to how the IRAC version works. So I mentioned before, many of you will find that handwriting things out helps it stick in your brain, but there will be benefits in making sure that you've got your citations and key quotes if you're going to use them, ready to copy and paste into your paper. Now, again, I strongly advise that you don't pre-write exam answers, because you will be tempted to answer the question you want instead of the question you've got. Now is a really good time, if you haven't already, to have a good look at the lecture materials again. Everything is online for you. I know there's hours and hours and hours of it, but it's a really good opportunity for you to revisit. Particularly, I would focus on the topics from week 1 through, and then sort of skip the technology topics to start off with, and really look at all of the ethics topics. There will be value, particularly, and be strategic here. I would definitely make sure that you look at the last topic, which is a technology topic, but it does pull the technology and ethics together in a really neat way and help you think about it. Also, that topic has clearly not been the subject of any assessment task so far. So when you're thinking about the technology, I would definitely make sure that week 11 is the one that you focus on there. But you've got all of those you've got all of those lectures. So you've been through them all once now. Now there's no surprises, right? Absolutely no surprises. You know how it all comes together. So you can listen to the earlier classes through a slightly different lens, having thought about subsequent issues. You got a whole lot of tutorial questions there. There's recordings of the tutorials, and Mary has so kindly put summaries together. They are really useful. Again, practice under time conditions, write your answers, and then listen to the feedback to see how you went. Practice essay writing. Couple of things here. Number 1, in an essay is not the written down version of The Sixth Sense. I don't want a twist at the end. It is not a mystery novel. I want to know in the first couple of sentences what you think. Similarly with the problem questions, what's the answer? Your client does not want to go all the way to the end and get a kind of surprise result. It needs to be up front and center. So your introduction is incredibly important. Similarly, your conclusion. There shouldn't be anything new in the conclusion, but when you are writing an essay, it needs to have an introduction that sets out what you think the answer is and how you got there. It then will need a couple of reasons for that. Separate idea for every paragraph. Keep your sentences short, use active language, communicate as effectively as you possibly can, and be judicious about the choice of citations that you use. So citations, think of them as examples. Think of them as material that supports your point of view. But remember, you're a lawyer. You have an obligation to make sure that you're not twisting the law to suit your point of view. There could be a range of different approaches, and you should address that. And then in the conclusion, pull it all together. Don't tell us anything new. Be snappy, concise, make it really clear where you land. And again, practice under time constraints. There's a lot of research, and many of you doing VCE or HSC recently would have been told about this. One of the best ways to practice for an exam is to do it under the conditions that you're going to do the exam in. So they possibly said to you at school, if you wore a school uniform, if you had to wear school uniform when you were practicing your exam, then you should wear school uniform, in the real exam, wear school uniform when you're practicing. Might be a good opportunity to take out your school uniform again, get yourself back into that time of life. I don't know. But again, if you need to set yourself up so you can do this with no distractions. Get somebody else to take the dog, the little kid, your nana for a walk. Make sure that you are home alone, or that there's somebody else who can go to the door when the postman comes. Make sure that your internet is working. Make sure that you haven't got distracting things on your computer or on your desk, and practice in exactly that same way. My top tips, I would use, and I've mentioned this before, use IRAC for your case summaries. Get used to thinking about bunching that information up and pay attention to the way that you can extract the IRAC information from a case, because you can reconstruct. It will help you with your style of writing later on. Think about the ways that you're going to find things on the fly, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier as well. Color coding could be great. Having an index, using Control F, whatever it is that you need to do to make sure that you've got access to what you need. Some of you will be absolute guns with using Notion or Evernote or something like that. You will have absolutely sorted all of those materials out. Now is not the time to set up a brand new system. Now I would approach the way that you organize your materials similarly over all the subjects you have exams for, because you're under a lot of pressure. You do not want to be swapping and changing. So think about what works for you, get your system up and running, and stick to it. It is really easy to procrastinate or organize. When I was at uni, I spent a lot of time highlighting or rewriting out my citations really neatly. That was not studying, it was busy work that made me feel like I was achieving something, but I was really avoiding doing the hard yards. It's harder now. You need to do that. Also, I mentioned this before, you can't assume that you will have access to the textbook in the exam if you've been using it online. Make sure that you have notes that cover off the key elements of the readings, and there are a lot of them. There is no guarantee that the nub of your question will have been covered specifically in a lecture or in a tutorial. All of the readings, all of the material is examinable. Yeah, it's scary, but we know you can do it. So that's all I've got for this video. Over the coming couple of weeks, I'll be eking out some sort of top tips, highlights, summaries for each of the topics that we've dealt with so far. If you've got specific questions about any topics, please let me know and I'll make sure that I include them. But for now, have a great weekend and all the best for week 12 and then for the exam period. As soon as we know when your exam is, we will share that with you. It's very likely that you'll know before us because that information gets conveyed to you. So keep an eye on Canvas, and yeah, as I mentioned before, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you. All the best. Cheers.